The bailiff was the only person in the room who still looked at Warren Doyle like a man instead of a headline. Everyone else in the Ashcombe County courtroom had already decided. The reporters in the back row decided it when the prosecutor read the number out loud on the first morning. $214,600, moved out of Corrigan Freight Holdings over 11 months by a senior accounts payable auditor who had access, motive, and, according to the state, no shortage of opportunity. The jury decided it a little more slowly, watching him the way people watch something they're trying not to feel sorry for. His former co-workers decided it the day they stopped returning his calls. Gus Pemberton, the bailiff, had worked this courthouse for 31 years and had learned not to decide anything until the last witness was excused. He held the side door for Warren each morning, said the same 4 words, "Chin up, son," and moved on to the next case like it cost him nothing. It cost him nothing to say. It meant something to a man who had stopped expecting anyone to say anything to him at all. Warren sat at the defense table in a gray suit that had belonged to his father-in-law, because his own suits had been packed into boxes when Corrigan Freight terminated him, and he had not felt like buying new clothes for the version of his life that included a felony trial. He was 34 years old. He had a daughter named Josie who was 8, who still packed his lunch every morning out of a stubborn, uncomplicated love that refused to notice her father no longer had anywhere to take it. That morning, it had been a turkey sandwich, an apple cut into slices the way her mother used to cut them, and a napkin with a crayon sun drawn in the corner. He had eaten none of it by lunch recess on the first day of his trial. He had given it away instead. If you're already leaning in, go ahead and hit like, subscribe to Hidden Ledger, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. He had almost nothing left to give away. He gave it away anyway. Keep watching. The woman was sitting on the low stone wall outside the courthouse steps when Warren came out for the recess. A thin gray cardigan pulled around her shoulders against a wind that had teeth in it. She looked to be pushing 80. Her hands were shaking in a way that wasn't entirely the cold, and her eyes had the unfocused, searching quality of someone trying to remember what street she was supposed to be on. "Ma'am," Warren said, "you doing all right?" "I'm waiting for Dennis," she said. "He was supposed to meet me at the corner." "I think I came to the wrong corner." There was no Dennis anywhere on Delancey Street. There was no cafe within 3 blocks that matched what she described. Warren sat down beside her, not too close, and asked when she'd last eaten. She said she couldn't remember, which was its own kind of answer. He unwrapped Josie's sandwich, tore it in half out of some instinct that felt more like manners than generosity, and held out the larger piece. "I couldn't," she said. "You'd be doing me a favor," Warren said. "I've got a trial to get back to in 20 minutes, and I won't be able to eat a bite of it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to be cataloging something. Then she took the sandwich. Her name was Vivian. She didn't offer a last name, and he didn't ask for one. She told him her son worried about her walking alone, which was, she said, exactly why she still did it. She asked what kind of trial pulled a man in a borrowed suit out onto a courthouse wall to give his lunch to a stranger, and Warren told her the truth, plainly, the way he'd told it to no one else in 5 months, because plain truth had stopped sounding believable even to him. He'd found something wrong in the books at work. He'd reported it. Somehow he was the one now accused of it. Vivian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said only, "That's a strange kind of justice," and reached over and patted the back of his hand once, the way an ant might. He walked her to the courthouse steps, asked Gus to keep an eye on her until someone came, and went back inside to be called a liar in front of 12 strangers for the rest of the afternoon. 9 years earlier, Warren Doyle had started at Corrigan Freight Holdings loading trailers on the night shift, the kind of job a young husband takes when his wife is finishing her nursing degree and somebody has to keep the lights on. He'd taken night accounting classes at the community college, 2 towns over, not because he had some grand plan, but because numbers made sense to him in a way most things didn't. People lied. Numbers, when you looked at them long enough, eventually told you the truth. Renee had been proud of him the year he moved from the warehouse floor into the back office. She used to say he had the kind of mind that noticed when a decimal point was in the wrong place across a spreadsheet of 4,000 rows, which was true, and which was also the reason everything that happened later happened to him, specifically, and not to somebody else. The night classes had run 2 years longer than the associate's degree technically required, because Warren kept adding sections. payroll systems, forensic accounting basics, taught by a retired auditor who liked to say that fraud never hid in the big numbers, only in the ones too small for anyone to bother checking twice. Warren used to come home from those Tuesday night classes and walk Renee through what he'd learned at the kitchen table, and she used to tease him that he'd married a man who found ledgers romantic, and he used to tell her, only half joking, that a clean set of books was its own kind of honesty. Neither of them had any idea, back then, how much that particular belief was going to cost him. She died on an icy overpass 3 winters ago, on her way home from a night shift at Ashcombe General. Josie was 5. Warren didn't remember much about that year except the particular quality of the silence in the house after her bedtime, and the fact that Corrigan Freight had let him take 2 unpaid weeks without asking a single question, which was more grace than he expected from anyone, and which was part of why he stayed loyal to the company long after he probably should have started looking elsewhere. By the time Josie turned 8, Warren was the senior accounts payable auditor for Corrigan's Ohio and Kentucky routes, reporting up through the CFO, a man named Russell Cade who had been with the company for 22 years, and who everybody, including Warren, considered a known and trusted quantity. Cade remembered birthdays. Cade brought donuts on the 1st of the month. Cade had, as far as anyone in the building knew, nothing to hide. What Warren found, in March, was a vendor called Frail Logistics Solutions LLC that appeared on the books 4 times a year in suspiciously round numbers, with no corresponding delivery manifests, no yard sign-in records, and a routing number that traced, when Warren finally bothered to trace it, to an account category the company's own procurement software flagged as personal rather than commercial. He wrote it up the way he'd been trained to write things up. Calm, factual, no accusations, just numbers laid out in a compliance email addressed to Russell Cade. Because Russell Cade was who you told. He never heard back. He assumed, in the way a man assumes when he has no reason not to trust the person above him, that it was being handled. It was being handled, just not the way Warren assumed. Russell Cade had bought a lake property for his second wife 2 years earlier, at the top of a market that had since fallen out from under him, and had spent 18 months quietly bleeding money to cover the difference. Frail Logistics Solutions was registered to his brother-in-law's name and had been feeding him a slow, steady drip of company funds since the property closed. It was never supposed to be noticed. Warren noticing it, and worse, writing it down and sending it up the chain in a dated email that lived forever on a server, was the single worst thing that had happened to Russell Cade's carefully managed second life. So Cade did what frightened men with access sometimes do. He got quiet, and he got busy. Corrigan's systems had migrated 2 years prior, and Warren's old remote admin credentials, the ones tied to a role he'd been promoted out of, had never been formally deactivated. Cade knew this because Cade, as CFO, had signed off on the migration audit himself. Over 6 weeks in the spring, he routed 3 transfers totaling $214,600 through those dormant credentials, at times of day carefully chosen from Warren's own calendar. A conference in Columbus, a Tuesday afternoon parent-teacher conference at Josie's school, sign-in sheet and all. Times when Warren could prove, on paper, that he was somewhere else entirely, which mattered not at all once Cade also quietly edited the timestamp metadata on Warren's original compliance email, so that it appeared to have been sent 2 days after Cade claimed to have first flagged suspicious activity in the department, rather than 2 days before. Cade built the frame carefully, over 6 patient weeks, the way a man builds something he intends to trust his own future to. He waited until the 3rd transfer had cleared before he made his first move, which was to walk into the CEO's office himself, looking appropriately troubled, and report that he'd noticed some irregular activity tied to a junior auditor's credentials. It was, in its own quiet way, an elegant piece of theater. The man who had stolen the money became the man who discovered the theft, and the man who had actually discovered it 5 weeks earlier became, on paper, the only person whose fingerprints were anywhere near the crime. By June, Warren was sitting in a conference room across from Corrigan's outside counsel and a detective from the Ashcombe County Sheriff's Office, being shown printouts of his own login sessions and asked to explain transactions he had never made. He remembered staring at the printed timestamps and feeling something close to vertigo, the specific disorientation of being confronted with proof of your own guilt for a crime you know, with total certainty, you did not commit. He kept saying the same thing, quietly, over and over. because it was the only true thing he had. That's not me. I don't know how that's there, but that's not me. He was fired that afternoon. He was arraigned 6 weeks later. Josie asked him once, in the car, why the other kids at pickup had started looking at her funny, and Warren told her the truth in the smallest words he had. Some people made a mistake about Daddy, and it was going to take a while to fix, and none of it was her fault, and none of it was going to change how much he loved her. She nodded like she believed him, in the way children believe things, because the person saying them is the person they trust most in the world, and that trust was, some days, the only weight-bearing thing left in Warren's life. He didn't have money for a private attorney. What he had was Sam Okafor, 29 years old, 11 months out of law school, carrying a public defender's caseload that would have broken most people twice his age. Sam read the file at midnight, because midnight was the only hour his desk was quiet. He believed Warren from the first meeting, not because Warren was persuasive, but because the timeline didn't fit. A man who genuinely stole $214,000 didn't calmly hand his employer a written report, flagging the exact irregularity that would eventually be used to convict him. Their first real working session ran 3 hours in a cinder-block meeting room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Sam filling a legal pad while Warren walked him, line by line, through 9 years of Corrigan's procurement software, the way he used to walk Renee through payroll systems at their own kitchen table. Sam didn't follow half of it on the first pass. By the third hour, he understood enough to know that whoever had built the case against Warren Doyle had chosen exactly the numbers a jury wouldn't think to question, and exactly the dates Warren, of all people, would never have gotten wrong by accident. Sam requested a subpoena for Corrigan's internal server logs. The judge denied it on procedural grounds, citing an ongoing internal compliance review that Corrigan's attorneys swore was still underway. A review that, as it happened, never once interviewed Warren. Warren absorbed all of it, the way he'd learned to absorb things since Renee died, quietly, without letting Josie see the weight of it land. He stopped going to the grocery store on Saturdays after a former coworker turned her cart around in the cereal aisle rather than say hello. A neighbor who used to let her son ride bikes with Josie found reasons, 3 weeks running, why that Friday wasn't a good Friday. Warren didn't argue with any of it. He signed Josie up for the after-school art program instead, so she'd have somewhere warm to be that wasn't a house full of unopened mail, and he drove for a rideshare app most nights after she was asleep, because a man on trial for embezzlement does not get hired anywhere that runs a background check, and everywhere runs a background check. The trial opened on a gray Tuesday in October. The prosecution's case was built entirely on the paper trail Cade had constructed, and it was, Warren had to admit privately, a good paper trail. Login records, a spreadsheet found on his old work laptop that he had never seen before and could not explain, because Cade had planted it there in the 2 days between Warren's termination and the police seizing his equipment. The compliance email, twisted by 2 altered days into looking like the panicked cover story of a man who'd been caught, rather than the report of a man doing his job. Russell Cade testified on the second day, in a Navy suit, with the easy, sorrowful authority of a man everyone in the room already trusted. He said he'd always liked Warren. He said that made this harder, not easier. He said the numbers didn't lie, even when the people behind them did, and 3 jurors nodded along like he'd said something wise, instead of something rehearsed. On cross-examination, Sam Okafor tried to open a crack in it. He asked Cade why the compliance email Warren had sent in March never once appeared in any meeting minutes, any follow-up thread, any evidence that it had been taken seriously by anyone at Corrigan before the transfers themselves occurred. Cade said, evenly, that he honestly couldn't recall the specifics of every email that crossed his desk in a given month, which was, he added with a small, regretful shrug, exactly the kind of oversight that haunted him now. 2 jurors wrote something down. Sam sat back at the defense table, looking like a man who had thrown his best punch, and watched it land on nothing. Warren sat and did not react. He had promised himself, the first morning, that whatever happened in that room, Josie would never once see her father come apart in public. So he held still, the way Gus Pemberton held the door, the way Vivian had held that half a sandwich in both hands like it mattered. Quiet was the only thing left he could control. At home that night, Josie asked him, over reheated spaghetti neither of them finished, whether he was going to have to go away. Warren had rehearsed a dozen answers to that question over the past 5 months, and none of them had ever sounded true when he practiced them alone in the car. What he told her, in the end, was simple. He didn't know yet. He told her that not knowing was a hard, scary thing to sit with, and that she didn't have to pretend it wasn't. She nodded, and reached across the table, and moved his fork half an inch closer to his plate, the way she did when she wanted him to eat and didn't know how else to say it. If this one has already got its hooks in you, make sure you're subscribed to Hidden Ledger with notifications on, because you don't want to miss where this goes next. There are more stories like this one waiting, and they're worth the wait. That evening, Sam Okafor called with the kind of voice that meant he had run out of moves. The judge had set closing arguments for Friday. Unless something changed, and nothing was likely to change, Warren was going to be convicted on the strength of a spreadsheet neither of them had ever laid eyes on before it appeared in a police report. Warren didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with Josie's crayon-decorated napkin still folded in his coat pocket from the day he'd given away her sandwich, and he thought about Vivian on that stone wall, waiting for a man named Dennis who was never going to show. He wondered, absurdly, whether she'd found her way home all right. It was the only thing that day he could think about without his hands starting to shake. Vivian Castellane had not been lost in any way that mattered to her doctors. Not exactly, though her son had started insisting on a driver for her errands anyway, over her repeated and increasingly pointed objections. She valued her own 2 feet. She valued being a woman on a bench instead of a name on an insurance policy. And most days, that independence cost her nothing worse than an occasional wrong turn. She would not stop talking about the man in the gray suit for a week. Not his name, which she'd forgotten by dinner time, but the shape of the kindness. A man on trial, worried enough about his own future that his hands weren't entirely steady either, tearing his daughter's lunch in half for a stranger he owed nothing to. She told her son Julian about it on the phone on a Thursday, the way she told him about most things now. Half a story dropped into the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. Julian Castellane ran Castellane Capital Group out of an office 40 minutes from his mother's apartment, and rarely, by design, involved himself in the daily operations of the 24 companies the fund controlled, Corrigan Freight Holdings among them, in which Castellane Capital had held a 71% controlling interest since 2014. He preferred people who knew logistics to run logistics, people who knew freight to run freight. He read the weekly legal exposure summaries his general counsel prepared for every portfolio company, though, every Sunday night, out of a habit that had nothing to do with distrust, and everything to do with the fact that numbers, like his mother's stories, sometimes told him things nobody had gotten around to saying out loud. The Sunday after his mother's phone call, Corrigan Freight Holdings appeared on the legal exposure summary under an unremarkable heading: Employee-related litigation, pending criminal matter. Warren Doyle, Senior Accounts Payable Auditor, terminated. Julian read the name twice. He remembered, distantly, his mother mentioning a courthouse. He remembered a gray suit. He told himself it was almost certainly nothing, the kind of coincidence a mind manufactures when it's looking for one. And then he picked up the phone anyway, and asked his internal forensic team, the same small group that ran quiet integrity checks across every portfolio company twice a year, to pull the file. It took them 4 days to find what nobody in 5 months of official proceedings had bothered to look for. The IP address behind the disputed midnight transfer traced not to Warren Doyle's home network, but to a residential account 40 miles away, registered to a man who turned out to be Russell Cade's brother-in-law, the same brother-in-law whose name sat quietly on the incorporation papers for Faro Logistics Solutions LLC. The document metadata on Warren's original compliance email showed, under even the most basic forensic review, that it had been edited 2 days after its supposed send date, a detail the county's overworked digital forensics unit had never had the funding or the mandate to check. The lead forensic accountant, a methodical woman named Priya Anand, who had spent a decade untangling exactly this kind of paper trail for Castellane's portfolio companies, put together a report that ran to 40 pages and boiled down, in the end, to a single sentence she underlined for Julian's benefit. The man convicted on these documents could not, on the timeline the documents themselves established, have been the person who created them. She flagged it as urgent. She flagged it, in the margin of her own cover note, as the kind of thing that shouldn't wait for Monday. Julian Castellane read the report standing up in his own kitchen at 11 at night, and something in it made him think, with an unexpected and uncomfortable clarity, about a man handing away his daughter's lunch on the day he had every reason in the world to think only of himself. Warren didn't know any of that on Friday morning when he walked into the courthouse for closing arguments. Only that Gus held the door, said, "Chin up, son," the same as always, and that something in the way he said it sounded, for the first time in weeks, less like a courtesy and more like a promise. The courtroom was fuller than usual. Julian Castellane sat in the third row of the gallery, in an unremarkable gray coat, a man nobody recognized, because nobody in that room had ever seen a photograph of him, next to a lawyer from his general counsel's office, carrying a slim leather folder. Sam Okafor noticed him only because the man's attorney approached the defense table during the 10-minute recess before closing arguments and asked quietly whether counsel might have a moment. What followed took 11 minutes and changed everything. The forensic report. The IP trace to the brother-in-law's residence. The metadata timestamp discrepancy on the compliance email, laid out in a way that made the fabrication almost embarrassingly easy to see once someone had bothered to look. Sam Okafor's hands were shaking by the time he finished reading. Not from fear this time, but from the particular disbelief of a young attorney who has just been handed, free of charge, the thing his office never had the budget to find on its own. The judge granted an emergency hearing before closing arguments could begin. Julian Castellane was sworn in as a witness that afternoon, and when the prosecutor, visibly thrown, asked him to state his relationship to the case, he answered plainly that Castellane Capital Group held controlling interest in Corrigan Freight Holdings, that the forensic findings had been generated by his own internal team, and that he was there because his company had a controlling interest and, he added, because he had personally spoken to the woman his mother described meeting outside this courthouse in October and confirmed the encounter matched. Russell Cade, 3 rows back, went the color of old paper. He looked, for the first time in 5 months of composed, sorrowful testimony, like a man doing math in his head and not liking any of the totals. His attorney leaned toward him and murmured something Warren couldn't hear, and Cade shook his head once, a small, involuntary motion, before catching himself and going still again. The prosecutor asked for a 15-minute recess to review the forensic materials, and used almost all of it standing in the hallway with the sheriff's detective who had built the original case, both of them scrolling through the same report on the same phone, their faces doing the particular arithmetic of people watching a conviction they were sure of come apart in real time. The forensic accountant who followed Julian to the stand walked the jury through the IP trace, the shell company's incorporation records, and the metadata analysis in language plain enough for anyone to follow. By the time the judge called a recess to allow the prosecution to consult with the sheriff's office, Russell Cade's own attorney had already begun, very quietly, asking for a moment alone with his client. Cade was arrested in the courthouse hallway before the day was out, on charges of theft, forgery, and tampering with records. He did not resist. What little composure he had left seemed to leave him all at once, and for a moment, standing against the wall with his hands behind his back, he looked less like the man who had testified 2 days earlier and more like exactly what he was. A frightened man who had spent 18 months convinced there was no way out of a hole he'd dug that didn't run through somebody else's life. He told the arresting officer, unprompted, something about his wife's illness and the money he thought he'd be able to put back before anyone noticed. Nobody in that hallway had much room left to feel sorry for him, though a few, Warren included, found that they did anyway. In some small and complicated corner they didn't examine too closely. The charges against Warren Doyle were dismissed the following Monday. The county prosecutor's office issued a statement acknowledging the error, which was as close to an apology as that particular office had ever come. Corrigan Freight Holdings, under new instruction from its controlling shareholder, issued a public statement of its own, naming Warren directly, confirming his full reinstatement, back pay for the 5 months he'd gone without work, and the establishment of an independent internal controls office, reporting directly to the board, rather than to the CFO's position that had, until recently, been Russell Cade's. Corrigan's board convened a special session the same week, at Julian Castellane's request, and voted unanimously to adopt every recommendation his general counsel put in front of them. A written apology, delivered to Warren in person by the company's president, rather than mailed by a lawyer. A public correction to the record, distributed to every outlet that had run the original story under a headline with Warren's name in it. An independent internal controls office, structured so that no single executive would ever again be able to both authorize a payment and investigate a complaint about it. Warren was not in the room for the vote, but Julian called him that evening to read him the language of it, unprompted, because he said a man ought to know exactly what was being said about him before he read it in the newspaper. Julian Castellane offered Warren the job of running it. Director of Internal Controls, full authority to audit any subsidiary in the portfolio. A salary that would have seemed unimaginable to the man who'd spent 9 years working his way up from the warehouse floor. Warren said yes, and asked, in the same conversation, whether there was any way to make sure the county's public defender's office got proper funding for a forensic unit. Because a kid named Sam Okafor had built a defense out of school sign-in sheets and stubbornness and deserved better tools than that for the next person who walked through his door. There was a way. Castellane Capital's foundation had never funded a public defender's office before. It funded one that winter, and Sam got a raise, and an actual second chair, and a framed thank you note from Warren that he kept on his desk for years afterward. Warren also asked, quietly, whether anyone had checked on Gus Pemberton's pension, which turned out to be 2 years and 11 months from vesting after 31 years of standing at that side door. Nobody at Castellane Capital had any particular reason to involve themselves in a county employee's retirement account, and nobody did, in any official capacity. What happened instead was smaller and, to Warren, better. He showed up at the courthouse on his first morning back as a free man, found Gus at the same door, and told him the whole story from the beginning. The sandwich, the wall, Vivian, all of it, because Gus was the only person in that building who had never once needed convincing. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. If it moved you, the stories on your screen right now are ready to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed to Hidden Ledger yet, come sit with us for the next one. Every story we tell starts with someone counting on being overlooked. We think it's worth watching what happens when they're not. Vivian Castellane came to Josie's 9th birthday party in April, in a cardigan a shade warmer than the gray one she'd been wearing the day they met, carrying a book about trains that Josie read 4 times in the first week. She and Warren had lunch together, most Thursdays after that, at a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse, and neither of them ever ordered anything expensive, which suited them both fine. Sam Okafor stopped by that same diner often enough that the staff started setting a 4th chair without being asked. His office had a second attorney by then, a proper forensic contractor on retainer, and a framed thank you note on the desk that he told people, only half joking, he'd sue anyone who tried to take down. Gus Pemberton retired 11 months later, on schedule, with his full pension and a send-off from the courthouse staff that ran 2 hours longer than anyone had planned for. Warren drove Josie down for it, and Gus, shaking Warren's hand at the door one last time, said the same 4 words he'd said every morning for 5 months. Chin up, son. Except this time he was smiling when he said it, and this time neither of them needed the reminder. Josie asked her father once, months later, why he'd given his lunch away that day instead of eating it himself, when he'd looked so tired and so scared in every photo from that week. Warren thought about it for a moment before he answered. He told her he hadn't been thinking about being scared right then. He'd just seen somebody hungrier than him, and that had seemed, in the moment, like the only thing that mattered. Josie considered that with the particular seriousness of a 9-year-old working something important, all the way through. Then she said, that's probably why it worked out, and went back to her book, as if the matter had been settled all along, and had simply been waiting for the rest of them to catch up. Warren didn't correct her. There were things a grown man understood about luck and timing and the long, unlikely chain of a woman losing her way to a courthouse wall on exactly the right afternoon. And there were things an 8-9-year-old understood more simply and, as far as Warren had come to believe, more accurately. He'd given away a sandwich because somebody was hungry. Everything after that had just been the world, slowly, taking its time, deciding to give something back.